This
You get today.
conference will now be recorded.
All right, so so under the classes now, we've been looking at Azure DevOps as a CI/CD mechanism strategy. So you've been saying, how do you use Azure DevOps? How do you probably do a build pipeline? How do you probably do a release pipeline? How do you do a continuous integration, continuous deployment, and all these things out here, such. But before Azure DevOps became a major player, there is or one more tool known as Jenkins, which is a very popular CI/CD tool again. So let me increase out this again, which is a very popular CI/CD tool, and Jenkins is an infrastructure as a service. And why do companies probably go for Jenkins as opposed to let's say Azure DevOps out here as such? Probably you need much control over the tool. Probably you need much more, let's say, control over the configuration, much more control over the privacy and the security and all these aspects out here as such. But again, there is of course the administrative aspect that you can look at from a Jenkins level, because you need to install Jenkins, manage Jenkins, and do a couple of things out here as such. So again, in our course, we are primarily focusing upon Azure DevOps. Jenkins is just an add-on. Again, as a DevOps engineer, as an Azure DevOps engineer, specifically if you're applying for this particular role, you might not in all likely work with Jenkins, because Azure DevOps is, let's say, replacing all these things out here as such. But just in case, if you have a client who kind of asks you for Jenkins, you need to just understand the basics of it. And this class is all about, let's say, covering up the basics, the terminology of Jenkins, how to install that out, how do you get started with Jenkins, how do you create a simple project, and so on and so forth out here as such. Again, Jenkins is an open source tool. There are multiple alternative to Jenkins, including Azure DevOps, like you have something like TeamCity, you have Never Code, then you have Buddy Build and all these things out. And then lately you also have, let's say, something like GitHub CI/CD. Let's say GitHub is also coming up with something like CI/CD actions at their end. You have something called Agro CI/CD. So you have a lot of tools that are available in the market today in order to replace one another. But we are just looking at one of the examples of, let's say, something like Jenkins, and this is what we will try and achieve doing. So using Jenkins, I would like to do a continuous integration, and I would like to produce some artifacts, just like an Azure DevOps continuous integration pipeline does. So what today is the intention is that all my code is sitting in a GitHub repository. Let's move into the open source of it. So all my code is sitting into a GitHub repository out here. So this is a GitHub repository. It's in open repository again. We'll also see how what is the code looking like and all those things out here. And from the GitHub, I would want a Jenkins server to constantly listen to changes onto this code. So today we are not doing continuous integration. We are doing Jenkins into something known as a polling mechanism. When I say polling mechanism, this particular Jenkins server keeps listening to the changes inside this particular GitHub repository for, let's say, every 5 minutes. You can also do a continuous integration, shouldn't be a problem. But since we have already covered continuous integration, what it is, and all those things out here, I am giving another example of a polling mechanism out here, wherein Jenkins as a server listens to this particular repository for every 5 minutes and tries to, let's say, go ahead and produce the artifacts. And once the artifacts are pushed, or once the artifacts are created, we would extend this knowledge a little bit into, let's say, I'll just put the artifact here, and we will take this artifact and start using another deployment tool. So we are using Jenkins from a continuous integration perspective or a build perspective. And here we will introduce one more deployment tool called Octopus. So again, this is another tool called Octopus CD. The most, let's say, popular CD tools out here available out there. Again, it does come with licensing, does have a free trial version of the same thing out here as such. And using Octopus as my tool, I would like to go and deploy out to an Azure web app. This is what we would like to do out here as such in order to go ahead and, let's say, do these particular deployments. So this is the overall architecture. This is the overall flow cycle that I'm actually looking at from a GitHub repository to a Jenkins server. And today's class is all about how do I configure Jenkins, or how do I firstly download and install Jenkins. We'll start from that. Download and install Jenkins. Then how do I configure Jenkins? What are all the required softwares that I need to install, and so on and so forth. And most importantly, where do I configure Jenkins? Where do I really configure this out? How does it really run? And what kind of a control that I can do? And how can I produce the, let's say, an artifact and so on and so forth out here as such. So using this example, my intention is to make sure to just give you all a basic to an intermediate understanding of what really a Jenkins server is, what kind of control that you can do at your end, and what kind of, let's say, customization that you can do with Jenkins versus, what, where exactly can Jenkins really help you out, and so on and so forth. So this is the idea that I'm actually getting into. So before I get started with this, anyone, any questions that I can take before I can move forward?
If we have a Docker file,
Mhm.
where it will go in this scenario, where
In
will
this scenario, Docker file will be sitting inside this one, a repository.
oh, okay.
So, all your Docker files and all these things, right? So your GitHub is nothing but a repository,
Mm-hmm.
which is there in place of Azure repos.
Okay.
So if you have a Docker file, right, all you do is that just run those Docker commands using the Jenkins. So Jenkins is nothing but a build server. So whatever commands that you give, it will go ahead and run this out. But in place of, let's say, Azure repos, you will be placing a Docker file here in the GitHub repository out here as such.
We will see the code now. We will see in the Docker file, right? The flow.
We are not doing a Docker. Here we are doing a basic, let's say, .NET build. But I can also give you the, let's say, code with Docker file also, so that you can try it at your end.
Yeah, sure, sure, sure. Thank you.
No problem. Any more questions here, guys?
Yes, sir. Sir, what is
Okay.
cooling mechanism?
Polling mechanism is just simple. So you have a server. So this server is nothing but a computer. On top of it, Jenkins software is installed. So this server is now continuously listening to changes. Meaning, earlier when you did a continuous integration, right? Whatever change that someone do, whatever change someone did, this change was going ahead and driving your pipelines. So it was triggering a pipeline from a change. But right now, it's the other way around. The server is actively listening for changes, and once it finds a change, it goes ahead and triggers a pipeline. So when this is listening to something, we call this as a polling mechanism. Meaning I'm asking my pipeline to schedule itself for every 5 minutes and go in and see into, let's say, that particular repository and look for some changes into that particular repository out here as such. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Correct. Yes, thank you. Thank you, sir.
All right, so let's then get started with Jenkins. Let's firstly understand how would I even go ahead and get started again. Jenkins has got a good documentation in something called Jenkins.io. So it tells build great things at scale and all that stuff. And if you go into the particular documentation out here, it's going to tell you a lot of things like, what is Jenkins, and what is the self-contained automation, about the documentation, downloading, and all that stuff. So it's telling installing Jenkins, where do you want to install Jenkins, and all these things out here as such. Now, what I would want to do right now is that I have some prerequisites out here. There is this particular document that I would like to share. Let me go there and give you the link, and let us see what exactly this link did. So again, all I did is that I just took bits and pieces of this particular documentation, and I've made an own document to just give us an idea about how do we get started with Jenkins and what do we all need, to get started and all those things out here. So I'll take a reference to this documentation, and using this documentation, I'll show you how to use this documentation and how do you, let's say, go ahead and build your own Jenkins and all these things out here as such. So let's get started then. So before you go ahead and do Jenkins, meaning before you go ahead and, let's say, start with Jenkins, see, Jenkins is a software. It has a downloadable, meaning you can go ahead and, let's say, download this particular software and then configure this out. Now, when I say you will have to download this particular software, right, you will have to download the software somewhere. And in my case, this somewhere or this platform is a virtual machine running on Azure. Again, this virtual machine can be hosted anywhere. It could be AWS, could be GCP, could be an on-premise server, it could be anything. It could literally, really mean anything out here as such. But in my case, since I know how to, let's say, build things on Azure, I went ahead and I created a virtual machine. So it's a Jenkins VM. Operating system is a Windows 2019 data center. It's a Windows virtual machine out here with a standard size, and it also has a public IP address out here as such. So it has a public IP address. So it's just a normal VM that you go ahead and create out here as such. And once I create this out, let me do an RDP into it. So let's say RDP, that's particular virtual machine. And let me go ahead and give my credentials. Let's say this user, and this is usually the go-to account that I use. And give a password out here. Such again, in an organization, right? This virtual machine may not have a public IP for you, or will not have a public IP. Rather, it will only have a private IP with VPN enabled. So before you go ahead and, let's say, log into this particular machine, you might have to, let's say, open your VPN, connect to it, and then go ahead and, let's say, do an RDP into that out here as such. So as of now, in my case, this is a public machine. In your case, when you start working in an organization, this will be a private machine out here as such. So again, I'll just wait for this particular, let's say, virtual machine to load. And once loaded, see, I would like to do some downloads out here. I would like to go ahead and, let's say, download some softwares and all those things out here as such. So I want this particular virtual machine to allow me to, let's say, go ahead and download some softwares over the Internet Explorer or whatever browser that I do have out here as such. So what what we'll do is that firstly we'll disable the firewall for a minute, or we'll disable the enhanced protection for a minute. So I'll go into the local servers, into the server manager, and then there is something called IE enhanced security advanced configuration. This is by default on. I'll just switch this off. So it reduces the exposure to web content and all that stuff. So I'll say I'll just switch it off and refresh the screen out. This should be off. And once this is off, let me go ahead and let's see if there is an Internet Edge browser here. It should come by default with an Edge. If it's not, then I will go ahead and download a Google Chrome browser. Okay, Microsoft Edge is there. So once inside this browser, I'll say start without data. Let's set up this out. Confirm and start browsing. So all I did is firstly created a virtual machine. This is the first step that I went ahead, created a VM. And now I am configuring the VM. Before I install Jenkins, right? There are a couple of things that I need to do. That's where my software installation for Jenkins comes into picture. Now I need to do a couple of things before I go ahead and, let's say, start with even Jenkins out here, before installing Jenkins out here as such. There is something known as a Java software that I need to install. Jenkins primarily runs on a Java JDK. Java JDK here means Java Development Kit out here. So Jenkins requires this particular Java to be installed. and that's the reason I have a documentation link. So all you do is just click on this particular link, do a right click, say copy link address, go into a virtual machine, and paste this link here. Again, it's a licensed product. It's a product by Oracle, and the reason being, I need to, let's say, before going ahead and let's say installing this out, I need to log into Oracle Cloud. So what I'll do is that I'll say no thanks. I'll stay here. I just scroll down, and this is Java 11 that we are downloading, and I am downloading for a Windows machine. So I'll just scroll down out here. It's a Windows 64-bit installer. This is what I want to download, and I'll say, you know what, this is the exe file. Please go and download this out. I'll say yes. I'll review this out, and I'll say download. So now it's going to ask you for your username and password for the Oracle Cloud. If you don't have one, just go ahead and create this out. It's a very simple creation. Ask you for your name, email address, and it gives you a verification code out here. In my case, I do have an email address, so let me get that. I have something called, it's a Gmail address that I have. So if you see this, I just created a Gmail and turned it into an account out here. And I'll just go ahead use this out. And once the sign in is successful, you'll go ahead and just download this particular software for you. So again, the account creation is also super easy. So if you look at this, just click on create account. All it asks you is your email ID and all that stuff, and the country and the pin code, and just go ahead and let's say create your account. So you don't have to, let's say, really do a lot of things out here as such. Just give your email address, have it created, and it'll take like a minute or so to go ahead and let's say create an account out here with Jenkins out here as such. Sorry, with Oracle out here as such. Once you create the account with Oracle and once you download the JDK, I'll just open this out. Okay, let's open the file and let's allow this to load. So I think it's loading in the background. So it's loading now. It's preparing to install. So I'll just go ahead and let's say complete the setup. I'll say next, and I'll just go ahead and let's say get the software installed out here on my machine. So all I'm doing is using this particular account. I'm getting my software installed on this particular machine out here. And the reason I'm installing a Java software here is because this piece of software, right? This becomes very important for me before I go ahead and let's say install Jenkins, before I even do something with Jenkins. There's something that I need to install. So if we just scroll this here, so now it's telling yes, Java is successfully installed. You can look at the documentation, all that stuff. I'll say close and done. And just to make sure that this is installed properly, just go into program files into this particular C drive out here, and you should see Java, and you should see the Java JDK and all these things installed out here as such. So bin and the exe files and all that stuff. So it's telling yes, Java is installed on your system. Good enough. Once it's done, the second thing is that if you look at my flow diagram, I am using Jenkins in order to let's say pull code from GitHub. So I'm saying go to GitHub and pull code, and it's a Git based repository. So since it's a Git based repository, right, your Jenkins software or your Jenkins server needs to run a couple of commands like let's say git clone, commands like git checkout, git pull, a lot of things out here as such. Sorry. And for your server to run these commands, you will need this software called git to be installed. Just like your local machine, I'm just going ahead and let's go into this particular server. The second piece of software that I'm now installing is Git for Windows. Because since you're using a Git based repository, you will need the Git commands to come into picture. So I'll say download this out. And the second thing is I'm going ahead and downloading and installing a Git based software or the Git software out here as such for a Windows platform. Again, straightforward installation, just going ahead and loading the installer. I'll just say next, next, and go ahead and let's say install this out. So all next here, nothing different. And let's install this out. And it'll take like a minute or so. And the next thing that I want to do is that See, I'm trying to build a .NET application using Jenkins. So we'll also look at the application code. So here I have given a link to the repository. So these are the three articles basically that you would require to go ahead and let's say start your journey. One is the prerequisites on what you want, an Oracle account and a virtual machine or a server with local administrative privileges, software installations and what all softwares that you need to download, and then in the configuration and setup, the link to the project. So let me open the project out and let's see this out. So here in my project, I have, let's say, the code, which is called random codes. Again, to answer someone's question, you have a Docker file here. So you have a Docker file that is readily available here. So if you want to, let's say, go ahead and let's say convert this into an image, you can simply run the Docker commands on top of Jenkins. Again, if you want to run Docker commands, right, you need to have Docker desktop installed on this particular machine. So that's a heads up. You will need to, let's say, have the Docker installed on this particular machine so that you can start using that particular Docker engine. You can start using that particular Docker server out here as such. That's something that you can do. But let's look at this. Let's look at the CS project file, and this is a .NET 3.1 framework. So it's a .NET 3.1, and also if you see, there are a couple of dependencies that are installed out here, that are mentioned out here as such, which means that I would need to do a .NET restore and all these things out here. So it's just a simple code with test cases also. So if you look at this, there are test cases that you also get. Yes, you will also get the test cases. It's a test.cs file, and I want to, let's say, also run these particular test cases against the code during the time of build. So whatever that I did with Azure DevOps, the build, the restore, build, and publish, right? Restore, build, test, and publish. The same thing I would want to, let's say, go ahead and do it from on a Jenkins server. Now the same thing I want to reproduce on a Jenkins server out here as such. So for this to happen, I would need .NET version to be installed. So that's the third software that I'll be installing. Telling, I'll say, .NET Core SDK download. So I'll go ahead, I'll do this. And here it's telling there's .NET Core 3.1 and all these things out here as such. So let's go there. So I have a 3.1 software, and here I'll just go ahead and say yes, it's a 64-bit version that I need, and it'll go ahead and let's say download that particular SDK for me. And I'll also install the .NET 6, which is the latest version, or which is rather the current version, I would say, not the latest. Latest would be .NET 7, basically, that they really recently released out here as such. So once it says install, I'll just go ahead and install this out. And it's now telling it's installing the .NET Core SDK, the runtime, and all these things out. And I'll also search for .NET Core SDK 6.1 or 6 download. And you'll also have the .NET Core SDK 6. And here you have the SDK. I'll go ahead and download for, let's say, an x64 operating system. And this is something that I would do. And this should be installed by now. I'll say close. And I'll also go ahead and let's say download the 6.0 SDK. So I'll have a couple of SDKs installed on my system. And all this is something that I'm doing before I'm even going ahead and install Jenkins. So this is just a simple installation that I'm doing out here right now. Uh, and I need all these softwares to be in place before I even go ahead and let's say install Jenkins out here. So that's what I'm really, let's say, planning to do out here as such. And that's what I have mentioned even in our documentation. In the software installation part, I've said yes, you need a Git for Windows. You don't probably need a Visual Studio full version. You don't probably need this out. The reason being, we are not building an ASP.NET full framework application. But again, it just depends upon what you're trying to build. If you're trying to build, let's say, a Python, then you need all those Python dependencies to be installed. If you're doing Docker, you need Docker to be installed. If you're doing .NET, in my case, yes, I'm doing a .NET. You need all those .NET dependencies to be installed out here, and that's what I'm installing out here as such. And once this is done, the installation was successful. This is good enough. This is where I will now start installing my major software, which is Jenkins. So I'll say download Jenkins. Just do a Google search of download Jenkins. It's saying yes, Jenkins download and deployment. I'll click on this. Again, pretty much open source, so you do not need even a login and all that stuff. And here there are two different versions. 2.3.2 is it's an LTS long-term support. So I'll say yes, this is the version that I need. and I will look for a Windows operating system out here as such. So I'll say, please download the Windows exe for Jenkins, and it's going to, let's say, go ahead and download the Jenkins MSA file. Again, it's a very simple installation, but we'll have to be a little careful while installing this out. And there are a little there are a little considerations to make while you go ahead and, let's say, install. So let's look at that. So let's close this browser now. I don't need that. And let's go to downloads. And I have this Jenkins software. I'll load this out. So now it's telling welcome to Jenkins wizard with, let's say, this particular icon. I'll say next. It's now telling where do you want to install Jenkins. I'll say yes, this is the file, this is the path where you install Jenkins, which is C program files in Jenkins out here. I'll say next. And now it's telling, you know what, Jenkins will get installed as a service on your computer. It's a service, just like an Azure DevOps agent. When you did an Azure DevOps agent, right? That was a service out here. So now it's telling me, can you give me the administrator account and the password of the administrator account, which has the privilege to start a service, not a server, sorry, service, to start a Windows service. Can this particular account start a Windows service out here? So let me just check that out. I'll just go ahead and I'll paste my account. This is test user, the same account that I have created, or the same account that I've given while I was creating the virtual machine. I'll just go ahead and say these are the credentials and test this out. So now it's telling the service account or the account that you are going ahead and giving. It might not have a privilege to log in into your machine as a service, or it might not have the privilege to go ahead and start up a service. This is the error that you get because this account doesn't really have that particular privilege. So what I'll do is that in order to, let's say, make sure that this is going to run successfully, I'm going to grant this particular account some privileges. I'm going to grant this account some privileges to go ahead and, let's say, start as a particular service. So I'll say local security policies. It's a desktop application. I'll search for this. I'll open the particular application called local security policies out here. And in here, I'll say local policies. I'll say user right management. And inside the user rights management, right, I'll just scroll down. And here you have something called a log on as a service, meaning there are some accounts which will go ahead and have this particular privilege. In my case, the test user doesn't have it. So I'll say, please add that particular user called test user out here. I'll say check names. It says yes, there's a user existing under Jenkins VM called test user. I'll say yes, please accept this particular user, and I'll say okay, meaning I'm giving a privilege to this particular user to log in as a particular service. And I'll now go ahead and test the credentials. You should get a green tick here. You should get a green tick. So that's what I'm doing to configure Jenkins. Firstly, I am installing Jenkins. Secondly, I went into my local system administration, the local policies out here. Uh, okay, am I in the right class? In Kubernetes topics. Kubernetes topics is tomorrow. You are in the right class. If you are, let's say, listening to Jenkins as from an ATM perspective, you are in the right class. Today is a Jenkins class out here for us. Yes. So yes. uh, as I was telling, I gave the local, let's say, system administration the privilege out here. I said this privilege is good, and I'll say next. And now it's telling, you know what, Jenkins will run on a port on your computer. So Jenkins is like, you can access it from your browser on a particular port. I'll say this port is good. 8080, test this out. This is telling yes, this is great. I'll say next. Now it's telling, okay, fine. You know what? For Jenkins to run successfully, can you tell me where is your Java 11 installed? I'll say, okay, go into Java and go into this particular file. I'll say okay. I'll say next. That's it. So I just selected the path where my Java is really installed. So there's this JDK is really installed. I'll say next, and it says okay, fine. You know what? These are the couple of exceptions that I need to take. I'll say okay, fine. Go ahead, take it out, and I'll say install. So very importantly, I had some local privileges and all these things to be given. And once that's done, it's telling yes, Jenkins is now installed out here. So again, couple of considerations to make out here. While you're installing Jenkins, make sure that whatever account that you have has a privilege to log on as a service. You need to have a privilege. You need to have a Windows privilege to log on as a service. If you do not have, I mean, if the account doesn't have that, then please grant it that particular privilege. And once that's done, also point out the Jenkins path, or sorry, the Java path, meaning where exactly that you have installed the Java software, the Java software path out here. So these are a couple of considerations that you need to make. And once that's done, once all of this is set up, once it says that Jenkins up and running and all that stuff, make sure you restart the machine once. This is important because you've installed a lot of softwares and the system needs to refresh out. So I'll just say restart. I'll say yes, continue, and we'll give it a minute to go ahead and restart this particular server. So I'm restarting the entire server. I'm restarting, let's say, going ahead and restarting the entire server out here as such. And once it's restarted, I can log back in, and then I can start configuring my Jenkins. Until now, I have just gone ahead and I have just went ahead and I said, okay, fine, you know what, I will install Jenkins. I do not say how the Jenkins configuration really works, so I'll need to configure Jenkins out here as such. So once Jenkins is configured, we'll see how do you create, let's say, a project, how do you create a pipeline in Jenkins, and how the artifacts are produced, and what are all the tool configurations that you need to really make out here as such. And again, it'll take like a minute or so for the server to get restarted. So anyone, any questions till here, guys? Anyone, anything till here? Any questions till here that I can take? Anyone, any questions that I can take till you? Again,
Mm.
yes. If
Uh,
just
Is
go
the
ahead, please.
what is the
Mhm.
main difference between the Jenkins and the Azure DevOps means? We have to install so many
Azure
softwares.
DevOps, to put it in a simple line, Azure DevOps is a software as a service. So when you say software as a service, right, all you need to do is just go buy the licensing for Azure DevOps,
Mm-hmm.
go to a URL, install nothing, start with Azure DevOps out here as such.
Mm-hmm.
And Azure DevOps is pretty much self-intelligent to go ahead and let's say give you a pipeline and all these things. So Jenkins, on the other hand, since it being an open source, it's not a software as a service. Jenkins is an infrastructure as a service, or rather, it's a combination of infrastructure and a platform as a service, and it falls somewhere in between that, wherein you're just going and downloading the entire exe, doing all the software installation beforehand, and then going and starting the server. So if someone asks you what's the main difference, then you can say the service model in which it really operates and the amount of administrative effort that one needs to take while configuring and setting up Jenkins out here as such. Those are, or those can, those are a couple of things that can be avoided using Azure DevOps, or when you use Azure DevOps out here as such. One more thing is that when you look at Azure DevOps is an integrated service. You have a repository, you have boards, you have pipelines, you have all these things which will work with each other in order to give you a complete software development lifecycle. Whereas when you look at Jenkins, right, Jenkins doesn't have its own repository. It needs to rely upon a Git or a TFVC. So you need to establish a connection between Git and that particular Jenkins server out here as such. Jenkins doesn't have its own artifactory, so you need to, let's say, probably have a JFrog or an Nexus artifactory to built in with that and so on and so forth. Neither Jenkins has its own boards, so you'll have to rely upon Jira or something like that in order to integrate that out here as such. So a couple of things. So Jenkins is just a piece of a software that helps you perform one particular operation. Azure DevOps is a whole suite of software that is available out there, which goes, it does build, does not only a build and a release, but also gives you the repository service, the pipeline services, and all these things which integrate with each other, have one common SLA out here as such. That would be a biggest difference between Jenkins and Azure DevOps. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. And if we
Hmm.
say like 1 minute,
Sure. Yes. So till that,
Sir,
good,
can we
please.
build?
sir, while
Can
opening that mm,
Go ahead, Kalyan. I'll come back to you one just in a second. Go ahead,
yes.
Kalyan.
yes, sir, while opening the Jenkins software, it asking password, username and password, right? So
Hmm.
that we have to give that virtual machine while creating the virtual machine, that
Correct.
password, that username password we have to give. Okay.
Correct. You will have to give the password of the VM that you have created. So it's the user account and the password for the VM out here as such.
Yes, sir. Okay. Okay, sir. Thank
Yes. Yes,
Is
any
there
more
any
questions?
requirement will be there like building this build you have to do by Jenkins and the release you have to do by Azure pipelines?
There
Does it?
might be, but very, very rare case scenario because see, when you're doing Azure DevOps, right, you're buying the entire suite of softwares. You have the build, release, and all that stuff. So in a very rare case scenario where the client already has a Jenkins build server and probably is trying to migrate into Azure DevOps or probably wants to maintain all that history, then yes, you can integrate Jenkins with Azure DevOps. Again, after 2019, even the integration support is taken off, even the plugin to integrate with Azure DevOps, even that is like really taken off right now. So most of the clients that we really work with have already migrated or are completely in the open source. So I haven't really come across a lot of requirement wherein your build is running in Jenkins and you want to, let's say, run a release in Azure DevOps out here as such. You can do that. It is a possibility, but very rare case scenario.
Okay. And the flow which you are saying is a basic like DevOps engineer flow, like GitHub, Jenkins,
Hmm.
which you have shown. This is the without using the Azure DevOps. This is a basic one, like
This is a basic
before
one exactly.
Before Azure DevOps, we can say it as SRE.
Kind of, you can say no. SRE is something which is different. Site reliability engineering is something which is completely different, which
Okay.
takes in a lot of factors like monitoring, which takes in security, a lot of things out here as such. So site reliability engineering is the next version for a DevOps engineer. So right now, people are not telling we are a DevOps engineer. People are telling we are an SRE, site reliability engineering out here as such.
Okay.
So yes, this was a flow that existed earlier to Azure DevOps. It also exists parallel to Azure DevOps, so you can also treat this as contemporary to Azure DevOps out here before it being earlier. You can also tell this is also parallel to Azure DevOps out here in case your organization doesn't want Azure DevOps for some reason for licensing and all those things. Out. They want to have a similar strategy to Azure DevOps out here, so you can suggest something like this.
This will work out with the AWS and also the GCP, like the
Anything,
VM we
yes.
can get from the AWS and GCP also.
GCP, anything. You can have AWS, GCP, on-premise servers.
Okay.
Anything it'll work out.
Okay. Thank you. Thank
You just need a platform where you can, let's say, install the software. That's it. So it can also be your own laptop. That's also super fine.
you. Okay.
Got any more questions, please? So the machine should have been restarted by now. So I'll just go ahead copy this particular link or copy the IP address of that particular machine and go into RDP and I'll just paste this and get copied first time. Let's give it another shot and I'll just go ahead and say connect and let's go ahead and let's say connect into this particular machine. Let's do an RDP into this machine, get connected to this machine, and let's allow it a minute for the machine to get started. And let's see what really happens. So once the machine is started right now, so it's now loading the server manager dashboard and all these things out here as such. Let's close this. I don't need this right now. All I need to understand is whether Jenkins is actually running or not. So what I'm going to do is I'll open my task manager. I'll say more details, services, and I'll open all the services out here as such. And let's look for a service called Jenkins. Let's see if there is a service called Jenkins which is actually running. So I'll just click on this. I'll hit J on my keyboard and now you see it is now telling that yes, there is a particular service called Jenkins which is running. It's telling this is the server, this is how it looks like, you can stop it, it's an automatic service, and this is the path to that particular executable, meaning you have a Jenkins exe out here, you have a path and all that stuff, and then you are using that test user as a password to log in and all those things out here as such, and there are no dependencies and all those stuff. Good enough. So I'll just come back. Since Jenkins is actually running, Jenkins is now running on my server. This is the server on which this is running on. So I'll go to the Edge browser again. And in order to open Jenkins, it's running on a port called 8080 of my machine. So if you look at that, right, when you are configuring Jenkins, it is asking which port that you want to run this Jenkins out. So I'll say now localhost colon 8080 and I'll just try to open this out and let's wait to see what really comes up. So once I do this, I now have Jenkins out here. Now, if I run the same thing on my local machine, right, there is nothing on my local machine which is running on 8080. So I'll say if I say 8080 There's nothing on my local machine really that is running here, so it says the site cannot be reached. In case of my VM, I have Jenkins installed. Now it's telling, okay, fine, you know what? I have now the Jenkins software that's installed and so on and so forth, and it is now running. And this is the welcome page. And the very first thing it tells you is that, you know what, in order to, let's say, go ahead and run Jenkins, you'll have to first give me the password for Jenkins. There is something called a Jenkins password, and it's telling, you know what, in your case, you'll find this particular password in this particular path. So I'll just copy this path, go into this particular path out here into my local machine, open this out with a notepad, and this is now a serial keyword that Jenkins gives you to unlock itself. So I'll say put the serial key out here. I'll say continue. So all I did is just went ahead, took that particular password, installed it out. Now it's telling customize Jenkins. I'll say yes. Whatever is the suggested software that you want, I'll install that out. I'll just click on this particular link and I'll start installing all these softwares out here. Such so it's telling now getting started, and it has a couple of softwares out here that it goes ahead and tries to install. Including a couple of plugins like Git plugin, pipeline plugin, a lot of things out here such to go ahead and let's say install this out. So once it's installed, we'll take like about a minute or so, and then we can get started with the configuration of Jenkins. So if you look at this, after I downloaded Jenkins, I configured Jenkins, and that's the step that I'm coming down to, is that I've installed Jenkins and now I'm configuring Jenkins. And there's something called global tool configuration and all these things out here as such before we go ahead and let's say create a pipeline. Before we go ahead and start to create that particular pipeline service and all that stuff, there are some global tool configurations that we need to do. So let's go there. And now it's telling yes, go ahead and create the first administrator out here. I'll say Jenkins user, give some password out here, and it's going to ask you for what is the full name. I'll say Jenkins user. I'll say user Jenkins. So there is a username out here that I've given. So I'll just go ahead and take that out. Telling user Jenkins09@gmail.com. Any email address is okay here. And I'll say save and continue. Now it's telling, what, this is the URL where Jenkins is running. So if you want to ever access Jenkins, please go ahead, take this URL and you're good. I'll say, okay, great. Save and finish. Now since Jenkins is ready, setup is done. Again, guys, very importantly, please do the setup either on a Google Chrome browser or a Microsoft Edge browser. Don't rely upon the Internet Explorer that you get on your system. So don't rely upon this. Softwares might not work because Internet Explorer doesn't have the latest version of Java installed and so on and so forth. So it cannot go ahead and let's say download all the softwares out here as such. So when you're trying to configure Jenkins, either use the Edge browser that is there, or if you do not like Edge, go ahead and let's say download the Google Chrome browser or Firefox, anything that is latest. But please avoid using the Microsoft Explorer out here as such. So that's the heads up. And I'll just go ahead and let's say start Jenkins. And now it's saying, okay, fine, welcome to Jenkins. You're the first user out here, which is called Jenkins user, logged in as this one, and so on and so forth. And this is how the dashboard really looks like. So it's a pure build-in release platform, mostly used for builds. Releases, yes, you can use it, but mostly used for builds out here as such. And before I go ahead and start doing anything with Jenkins, what I'm going to do is that there is a configuration that I need to do with Jenkins out here. So what I'll do is that there is the settings of Jenkins. I'll say manage Jenkins. And in here, there's something called global tool configuration. I click on this one. And once I'm inside this particular global tool configuration out here, there are JDKs and all that stuff. And now it's telling, what, I need the Git software to even begin with. And it's telling what is the path for your Git software. And remember, guys, that was the first thing or one of the first things that we installed. We went ahead after Java, we installed a Git software, right? And now I need to point out where is that particular Git software to Jenkins out here so that it can use it. So I'll go into my C drive. I'll say program files. Here I have Git. Here I have the bin. Inside that I have a file called git.exe. So I'll copy the path. And here I also already have a git.exe. I'll paste this path. I'll say /. So I'm just going ahead and giving Jenkins what is the path to my git.exe. I'll say save and done. So now if you go back into your global tool configuration, make sure that you have that particular git.exe path getting reflected. So this is one of the configurations that I'm doing before I get started. So if you see in Azure DevOps, right, you do not really have to install, let's say, all these things. You do not really have to, let's say, go ahead install, let's say, a kind of, let's say, Git server and all that, GitHub and all that stuff. You don't have to do that. It's a software as a service. You can directly consume it. You can start directly consuming it out. But when you talk about something like Jenkins, you'll have to do a lot of installation and configuration before you actually get started. So if you look at this, right, I took about 47 or 50 minutes out here till now to go ahead and even get started. I did not start with my pipelines, did not start with my service and all that stuff. I did not do all those things out here yet. I just went ahead and I'm just starting up with Jenkins. And to start up with Jenkins is the time that I took. One time setup, good enough. Now what I'll do is I want to build that code, right? I want to do that code build out here using Jenkins. So I'll say yes, go ahead, give a new item. I'll say it's a freestyle project with the name called, that code was called random code. So I'll give a project name called random codes again. This can be anything, literally, it can be anything out here. I'm just going ahead and naming the project, the name of the code out here, such. I'll say okay. And I'm now creating something known as a freestyle project. And once I say okay, it will now take me into the project configuration. Project here is nothing but a pipeline in Azure DevOps. So when you create a, let's say, a continuous integration pipeline in Azure DevOps, we call this as a project in Jenkins out here as such. And now it's in description. I'll say this is a sample project in Jenkins. I'll just scroll down and it's telling preview, do you discard old builds and all that stuff. I won't touch this out. Second thing, it's telling where is your source code, where exactly is your code. I'll say yes, my code is in Git. And here, right, in our configuration, this particular configuration, I have given the link to the repository. This is what I was talking about earlier. This is the entire link to the repository out here. So just click on this particular link, copy this URL, come down out here, paste this URL out here. That's it. All I'm doing is just entering the Git URL. It's an open URL, doesn't have any credentials. Now, if you have a private repository, you can just add that credentials out here. You can say yes, Jenkins. And once it gives you, you can give the username and password for your Git. And you can go ahead and start using that particular username and password. But in my case, this is, let's say, a public repository. So I'm just going ahead and, let's say, doing that particular or giving that particular link to the public repository. You can also give a private repository. Just you have to, let's say, generate the username and password and give that particular username and password here and test the connection. Should be good enough. I'll just scroll down. Now it's telling which branch that you want to select. Again, it's a master branch that I'm working on. This is the master branch where all the code is actually there. So this is what I'm really working on out here. So I'll say yes, this master branch is good enough. I'll just scroll down and now it's telling build trigger. How do you want to trigger this out? Do you want to trigger it remotely? Do you want to build periodically? Or do you want to poll the ACM? Meaning, do you want Jenkins to go ahead and, let's say, look into that particular source control manager, look into that particular Git repository for every sometime? So it's now telling, okay, fine, can you give me a schedule? Now, schedules here are mentioned in the form of cron expressions. There is something called cron expression. It looks something like this. You have to tell Jenkins. So, for example, in my case, I'll say, go into Google search. I'll say cron expression for every 5 minutes. It's going to tell yes. You have a lot of, let's say, things out here. Just a second. Anyone doesn't even have a question, guys? Still here. I heard someone say something. So okay, fine. So there's something called cron expression. So I said, what, give me a cron expression out here. So if you go into any of the websites out here, they're going to give you some cron expression telling that, what, build things for every 5 minutes and so on and so forth. Or if you want, let's say, the actual expression out here as such, again, it's telling, what, using this is better. So I'll take this as Jenkins suggested. I'll place it out here. I'll remove that particular, let's say, quotations and all that stuff. Now it's saying yes. This would now run in some scheduled times out here. So this is configured here. The next time would run on 324 for every 5 minutes. This is now gonna run is what it's now telling. And every time it runs, it will go into your URL that you mentioned here, look for changes of your code, and then start building your, or then start executing whatever that you want Jenkins to execute. That's where I'll just come down. So if I just scroll down out here, it's telling time zone specification and all that stuff. This is good enough. I'll go into build environment, nothing here. And now I'm coming down to the build steps. Now I'm telling what exactly Jenkins needs to do. What exactly does a Jenkins server wants to do out here? So I'll say add a build step. I'll say execute a Windows batch command. I'll say please execute a command. And the very first command that I'll go ahead and let's say run here would be .NET restore. So I'll ask Jenkins to go ahead and do a restoration for me. I'll say Jenkins, please go ahead and do a restoration for me out here in a configuration called release. If you want to mention this out, if you want to specify this out, good enough. After this, I want to go ahead and run something called as a .NET test. So I'll say execute again a Windows command, and I'll say please go ahead run a .NET test command out here. I want to test my Jenkins. I want to test my code out here using that particular test cases that I do have. Then finally, I'll again say add a build step, and I will say please run a command called .NET publish in a configuration called release. So whatever Azure DevOps was doing, restore, build, test, and something, I'm not doing a build out here because the publish command itself will take care of the build. So build is internally inside that particular publish command out here. So all these things, which is a restore, which is a test and all that stuff, I'm just using Jenkins server in order to run this out. And I'll now go ahead and do a save. So again, coming from the top, general, I said this is let's say a sample project. Next, I said source code management. What is a URL? I said trigger. How do I poll the ACM? What is the time interval that I need to poll? Build environment, nothing. Build steps. There are 3 different build steps that I've provided here. Also, I have given the same thing in the documentation as well, so you do not have to really scatter about anywhere. Here, I just did a .NET test and a .NET publish. I did not really do a restore. If you want, you can add a restore step out here as well, because the .NET publish, right, pretty much it goes ahead and let's say tries to do a restore and a build. So you do not really explicitly need to mention a restore. So you can remove that out. If you don't need this, you can just remove this out. So the .NET test and the .NET publish. I've also given how do you run that particular commands. And now I'll go ahead and save this out. And then I now have my project ready with me. And again, if you want to reconfigure this particular project, you can go ahead and say configure, and then you can go ahead and let's say do all your changes out here as such. So all these are now my changes. I'll just come back, and now I'll hit on the button called build now. I'll hit on this, and as when I do that, Jenkins will now go ahead and start running a build for me. This is a manual build again that I was doing, but goes without saying, for every 5 minutes, Jenkins is now going to go inside that particular repository, understand if there are any changes, and if there's any changes, it goes ahead and starts building your code and producing an artifact to your code out here. Again, if you want to check the logs and how it is running, you can just click on this, or rather click on this, and here you will have a console output. You can go here, and now it's telling all these things out here as such. So if you check this out, it's telling yes, this build was started by this particular user called as a Jenkins user. It's telling running as a system. It's telling you know what, this is where I will download the code. No git credentials are specified because this particular git is an open source, so it's pretty much let's say a public repository. So no credentials have been let's say specified. If credentials have been specified, it'll first try to log in, check if the login is working, then try to do a build. Then it's telling you know what, I will now run a git clone command. So using that particular git exe, it's telling you know what, I will clone that particular let's say command into this particular let's say folder. It's telling yes, it's going ahead and downloading all these let's say code from this particular URL out here as such. And once it downloads, then we are going ahead and running something called as a .NET test. So it's telling yes, you have a .NET 6 SDK, great. Now I'll go ahead and start running the test out here. So it's telling installed and all that stuff. It's telling determine the projects to restore, running the test cases. So it's telling, you know what, test is passed. There's one test case that I found. I ran that particular test case. This passed. And Jenkins will also go ahead and give you a .bat file. Bat here is a business acceptance test case. It'll tell you what is a report and all that stuff. And finally, I'm doing a .NET publish. I'm saying go ahead, do a .NET publish out here. So Jenkins is telling yes, I'll do a .NET publish. And finally, in this particular folder within your virtual machine, you will have all your build files or all your executable files out here. So if I just copy this and paste this out here, I have all my files here. Again, there is this particular root folder and all that stuff. So I have all my files, I have my test coverage. Everything is now ready. Everything is a DLL. It's got converted. Everything has got converted. This was my raw code. This is test and all that stuff. This was my raw code. Now everything got converted into, let's say, a DLL out here as such. So release.NET Core app. If you check this out, I now have all my folders out here as such and go to publish. I have the entire publish folder out here as such that is ready. That got published, that is built out and all that stuff. Now I can pack this out and then take it to a deployment with a kind of a release pipeline into Azure I mean into Azure portal and into a couple of into any kind of platform out here that I do have out here as such. This is how I did a build in Jenkins. So I mentioned the steps. Unlike Azure DevOps, you are not going to get a template. You'll need to mention the step out here. How did I mention those steps? By using configure inside that particular steps out here. I mentioned two steps. This can be anything else. You can also go ahead and run a Docker command. You can say in the same thing, you can say a Docker, let's say build an image, push that image into a repository like an ACRS or something like that. So you can also do that using Jenkins, but to do that you'll need a Docker engine that is installed on the particular on this particular, let's say, system out here as such. Yes, any questions that I can take till here? Anyone, any questions I can take till here on how did we configure and how did we build using that particular Jenkins server out here as such?
Kiran, when you're doing manage Jenkins,
Mm-hmm.
you've taken Git only. Jenkins will
Mm-hmm.
work with the version control tool only with the Git or usual.
You can also have, I mean, TFVC, which is Team Foundation Version Control. You can
Mm-hmm,
also have that, but you have to install the plugins for TFVC. So if you say manage Jenkins, right, then you
mm-hmm,
have manage plugins. So if you click on
mm-hmm.
manage plugins, you can search for a plugins called, or you say, let's say install plugins or run settings updates, available plugins. Just go to available, and you can say TFVC. You can have different, let's say, plugins for this, again, Team Foundation Version Control or TFS plugin, if I'm not wrong. There should be a TFS plugin basically that, let's say, Jenkins asks you for, or if you have a different repository like Bitbucket,
Okay.
you can say Bitbucket branch controller. So you have a TFVC plugin for Jenkins as well. So TFVC plugin for Jenkins. So plugin is called Team Foundation Server plugin. Say Team Foundation. So you have a plugin with some name out here as such. I'll have to check that out. But
Okay.
yes, you can have multiple plugins that are installed in Jenkins and you can configure that out. But since I have a Git repository and Jenkins, what it did, right, when we were configuring it, already installed that particular GitHub, right? So it already had that. So that's the reason I went ahead and gave this directly. But if you have a different, let's say, source control, then you can go and download that out and give the path to it. That should also work.
Okay. And one more thing, in the manage Jenkins,
Mhm.
when you go to manage Jenkins one,
Yes.
they manage nodes and clouds. What is that?
It's like an agent for Jenkins out here. So you can add multiple slave pools for Jenkins. So right now this is a built-in node. So if you see this out, this is a node that is running on, let's say, Windows Server 2019. But if you want to add multiple nodes out here, you can see new node and all that stuff. You can give the node name. You can say whether it's like an agent in Jenkins. So it'll give you a downloadable. You can go ahead, let's say, install that out on any of the servers. and that will become a node for you. Again,
The
configure
agent,
clouds as such, meaning yes, it's an agent. It's an agent for Jenkins, exactly.
like how we have used in Azure DevOps
Azure
agent.
DevOps, exactly.
Okay,
So
we
you can
can
go ahead and you
suppose
can
so.
add multiple machines here, exactly. In
Okay,
my case, if you see, there is only one machine, which is Windows Server, which is this machine that we are looking at. But
okay,
if you add a node, right, it will tell you what is a node name and all that stuff. So I can say this is a demo node or something.
okay,
I can say it's a permanent agent, and once I say create, right, it'll go ahead and give me all those downloadables. I can go ahead, take that executable files and install it on any different machine out here, and that machine will act as a different node in Jenkins. Or a node here is nothing but an agent in Jenkins out here as such. So you'll see all those things out here as such.
okay. Thank you.
Yes. Any more questions, guys? Anyone? Any more questions out here as such? Anyone? Any more questions out here that I can take with Jenkins out here till now on how did we configure? How did we build a project with Jenkins? Again, I'm just promoting Jenkins as an alternative to Azure DevOps. Again, when you go into an industry with a profile like Azure DevOps out here as such, mostly, not mostly, but in 99 out of the every 100 times, you are going to work on Azure DevOps out here as such as your primary build and release tool. But in case you need an alternative to it, and client tells you, okay, fine, you know what, I need this, and so on and so forth. Then probably that is where you can have Jenkins, or that's where you can have an alternative tool that is coming into picture out here. Finally, what I want to do is that, see, this Jenkins is inside a server, right? This Jenkins, right, is inside a virtual machine. This Jenkins is itself hosted on top of, let's say, a virtual machine out here, such. Now, I'm not really comfortable in giving the credentials to this particular virtual machine to everyone, because I don't want anyone to go ahead, come here, delete something accidentally. That will be very that will not be, let's say, very good for my organization, or very good for the code build process that I do have out here as such. What I want to do is that I now want to expose Jenkins. I want to expose Jenkins over, let's say, my intranet, over the internet service, since I have an internet today. I will try to expose Jenkins, and what I'll do is that I'll just go here, and firstly I will search for Windows Firewall, and then you have something called allow an app through firewall and all that stuff. Not this one. Let's go and Defender Firewall. Let's go into the advanced settings, and I'll say inbound and outbound rules. So I'll say inbound rule. I'll say a new rule out here, and this is completely Windows administration. So I'll say yes, I want to do a custom rule. I'll say next. I'll say all programs should access this out. I'll say next out here as such. Okay, not a custom rule. Let me do one thing. Let me open up a port. That's a better thing. I'll say port 80. I want to open this particular port 80 out. I would say allow the connection for this particular port. I'll say yes, domain public and private is good enough. I'll say Jenkins inbound rule. Underscore allow to make sure that it is clearly explicit out here. And I'm now saying yes, I want a Jenkins rule out here. And I'll also do an outbound rule. I'll say new rule, again the same thing, port. I'll say next. I'll say this is again 80. I'll say next. I'll say allow connections. I want to allow connections out here. I want to also do an outbound connection out here as such. And I'll say Jenkins underscore outbound underscore allow. The reason that I'm doing is that I'm not really comfortable in someone coming into my server and working in my server out here. This is not something that I would expect, because once you come into the server, I'm giving you all the control there. So you can delete anything, you can do anything out here. It's just very, it's dangerous out here, such, right? So now I have all the rules. What I can now do is that I've set up as an administrator. I've done all these things out. All I'll give you is an IP or a fully qualified domain name of my server. And once you go here and say enter, and this should also be, I mean, it will take some time for it to open out, let's say the Jenkins out here as such. So let's give it some time out here as such, and wait for this to load. And I'll also try this out on server or this particular browser. Usually a firewall rules takes like about 5 to 10 minutes for it to come into picture. So let me refresh this out a couple of minutes. And if it doesn't respond, let's come back a couple of minutes later and see if it's really loading out here as such. But I have now allowed my firewall rules, so this should in all likely be working. So let's try out a couple of minutes later, and let's do this. Okay, let's do this one thing, because Jenkins internally is running on a server called internally running on, let's say, a port called 8080, right? So let me also allow that port and see if this works out. Let's say allow an app, because I should have given an 8080, because on 80 there is nothing on this particular server it's running. So let me add one more rule out here. I'll say port. I'll say next. I'll say 8080. I'll say allow connection. This is good enough. I'll say this is good enough. Jenkins inbound. Let's finish. I'll add an outbound rule as well for 8080 as such. I'll say next. I'll say allow connections. That's next. I'll say next. I'll say Jenkins outbound. I'll say finish. After this, I also need to, since it's an 8080, right, it shouldn't be allowed by default. I'll go into my infrastructure layer, and here as well, I'll go ahead and add a rule. I'll say add a rule. This is any 8080 is good enough. I'll say allow. And I'll create an outbound rule as well with the same thing. Say add this 8080 allow. So I'm adding these two rules out here on my server. This is to make sure that I expose my Jenkins over, let's say, the browser, not allowing someone to directly log in out here as such. So now let's try this out. Again, it should take some time for this particular rule to come into play. So it will take about 5 or 6 minutes for this rule to come in. And once we check that out, here we go. And now it's telling, what, welcome to Jenkins. This is now a service that is running inside your virtual machine and can be accessed over a browser. And I can now say, since I have the user ID and password already, I'll just go ahead and log in into Jenkins. And here I am into my same project and all that stuff. So now, as a user or as a developer, your administrator might not give you the control over the entire server. You might not have this in all likely. You might not really even know where Jenkins is running. They are just going to give you an IP address, and using that particular IP address, you can go ahead and access Jenkins with the username and the password that is provided out here for you. And you can start using that particular Jenkins. Again, in my case, I'm using a public IP address. In your case, you'll all likely use a private IP address when you're inside the VPN. So this is much more secure way in order to access Jenkins, rather than allowing someone directly over the internet, and or rather than someone allowing directly someone over, let's say, giving the credentials to your virtual machine and asking them to, let's say, go ahead and log into your virtual machine. And in that case, right, you again have to do some Windows administrative control, telling which group that user belongs to, and a lot of things out here. So instead of going inside your VM and letting the user doing some changes, you are good to go ahead and expose this particular Jenkins over a browser. And in order to do that, I have given some firewall exception out here. And once I've given that particular firewall exception, this started to work out here as such. Yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here? In how do you configure, set up Jenkins, build a project, expose that out over, let's say, a port on the VM rather than directly going in and logging into that particular machine out here as such? And how do you start using this particular service? And how do you start configuring this out here as such? Anyone, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions, guys? Again, as a continuation to this Jenkins chapter that we have, we said Jenkins produce artifacts. Yes, Jenkins did produce artifacts, and all the artifacts are there inside this particular folder. Great. Now I want to use an octopus, then establish and then go ahead and, let's say, deploy that out onto Azure Cloud. But again, the issue with doing octopus over a live class, guys, is that a lot of dead air. meaning it takes a lot of time to configure Octopus, just like the VPN out here as such. So to that, I have done a video recording for Octopus out here, and I'll send it out. That should give us an idea. So where we stopped here with Jenkins, it should go ahead and start doing Octopus out here as such. So here I have the MP4 file. I'll just go ahead and send this link across. You can bookmark this out. And in here, I've given you the guide for Octopus. So this is the second class, or this is just the second session which we are giving the recording out here for. One was the VPN. Second thing is the Octopus. Again, it takes a lot of time to, let's say, configure this out. So I've said, how do you install Octopus? What do you download? How do you integrate Jenkins with Octopus? All of this is covered in the video, but I've also given the documentation link out here so that you can read this out or make your own notes. Then how do you create a project in Octopus? And finally, how do you integrate Octopus with Azure DevOps? And how do you, let's say, go ahead and deploy it out? Everything is explained. And again, the README file, you do not really have anything out here. But in the Octopus deployment guide, I've just mentioned this out, and I've covered the entire thing in the video session as well out here. So you can just download this out. And from where you have that particular Jenkins, you can now go ahead and start working with Octopus, pick up, let's say, all that particular artifact from Octopus using Octopus, and go ahead and deploy it out on top of, let's say, a Jenkins, or on top of, let's say, Azure out here as such. Yes, any questions still here? Anyone, any questions still here? Again, the links that I'm posting in the group chat, please make sure to bookmark it out. Please make sure to send it out across, because these are going to really, let's say, be important, guys. So please go ahead and bookmark it out somewhere or place it somewhere so that you can refer to it at a later point in time as well out here as such. Yes, anyone, any questions, guys? Anyone, any questions I can take before we close?
Kiran, if we are using now we are using the code in .NET. So we have
Mm-hmm.
given the commands like .NET Restore, .NET Publish, and .NET Test,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Correct.
So if we are using any other code like Java, those
Mm-hmm.
dependencies also we need to install on VM and
Those dependencies, yes,
also.
exactly. Yes, so you need to install dependencies on the VM. For example, if you're doing Java, you need a Java JDK or development kit out here.
Mhm.
That is something that you would need. And in case, let's say that you're working with the Java commands, so you have some Java commands out here to go ahead and do a build and so on and so forth. So you'll need these dependencies, and also you need to run those, let's say, commands out here. So whatever code that you're building, you will need the dependencies that are associated with that particular code out here as such.
In the flow which you have explained, where the
Hmm.
sonar will come into picture, like um, either
Sonar
if.
can come into picture after you do that particular .NET test, or rather you, let's say, do the .NET publish, right? Or
Mhm.
after you do, let's say, a .NET test, you can put in Sonar out there. So you can have plugins for Sonar. So if you look at, let's say, manage Jenkins, and you say manage plugins, and if you say available plugins, and if you look for something like Sonar out here, you have Sonar quality gate and all that stuff. So you have quality gates using Sonar. Warning can be ignored, so you can just go ahead and take this out. And in the flow inside the project, once you have that Sonar installed, you'll have a plugin there. So here, when you do a configure, and if you just scroll down after this particular test and before the publish, you can add one more step here, telling execute a Windows or execute, let's say, in that case, when you install Sonar, you'll have a Sonar out here. So you'll say invoke Sonar and all that stuff. So this is where Sonar can come into picture, and Sonar needs to come while you're doing this particular build process so that you can go ahead and, let's say, run that particular test out here as such.
Yeah, we will use the sonar for to check the quality of the code. That's it,
Correct.
or any useful
It's the
any.
quality of the code. No, it's a quality gate. That's the only use. It's a quality gate for so that you can go ahead and, let's say, check it out here as such.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Any more questions, guys? All right, so that's pretty much it from my end today. And guys, for this is a combined batch, 7 and 8 a.m. Both, I mean, both of them are there in this particular session. So for people of 8 a.m. guys, you will have, let's say, Kubernetes sessions from tomorrow. So we'll start with the basics of Kubernetes and understand what Kubernetes really is out here as such. And for 7 a.m., this is the last session, guys, for you. And in case you have, let's say, you want to attend Kubernetes once again, you can do that. There shouldn't be a problem. Just go ahead and have a word with the institute coordinator so that you are added to the 8 a.m. batch session so that you can start listening to Kubernetes from tomorrow. Again, for 8 a.m. guys, we will start with Kubernetes tomorrow. So tomorrow will be the first session of Kubernetes. And from day after, we'll have an evening session at 8 for Kubernetes out here as such. So that would happen for about 5 classes out here. So it will take like about a week for us to understand how to create Kubernetes clusters. How do you integrate Kubernetes with Azure DevOps, and what is AKS and all those things out here as such. That's going to be the idea for the coming week out here. Is any questions there, guys?
Sir, this is our last class for 7 a.m. batch.
Yes, this would be the last class for 7 a.m. Yes. All right. So thank you and have a good day ahead, guys. And for 8 a.m. guys, we'll meet tomorrow. And for 7 a.m., all the best ahead, guys. Thank you.